The Discernment Field, Episode 11, Narrative Capture and Reality Construction. How Stories Organize Perception. Hello, and welcome to the Discernment Field, a podcast on mind, behavior, perception, and the search for clarity in an emotionally reactive world. In the previous episode, we explored the economics of attention. We looked at attention as currency, perception, emotional energy, agency, and the gateway through which influence enters. We asked where awareness is being spent, what emotional state is being produced, who benefits from our focus, what we are being pulled away from, and what kind of reality is being built from what we repeatedly look at. The story that holds the world together. Now we move into the next layer. Because once attention has been captured, the next question is, what story is being built from what we keep looking at? Attention selects the fragments. Narrative arranges them into meaning. A headline captures attention. A memory captures attention. A conflict captures attention. A wound captures attention. A political message captures attention. A group identity captures attention. A repeated fear captures attention. But narrative is what tells those fragments what they mean. Narrative gives them sequence. It gives them cause. It gives them emotional direction. It gives them a beginning, a middle, and an expected ending. This is why we do not live by facts alone. Facts matter. Evidence matters. Reality matters. Truth matters. But facts do not enter into the mind as isolated pieces of data floating in empty space. They enter a meaning-making system. They are arranged through memory, emotion, identity state, language, culture, group belonging, moral framing, and expectation. We do not simply ask what happened. We ask, often unconsciously, what does this mean? Who caused it? What role am I in? Who can I trust? What should I fear? What kind of world does this prove I am living in? That is the narrative. Narrative is the meaning structure that tells attention what it has been looking at. Two people can see the same event and live inside completely different realities because they are not only seeing the event, they are seeing the event through a story. One person receives a delayed reply and thinks, they are probably busy. Another thinks, they are pulling away. Another thinks, I am being rejected again. Another thinks, people always leave. Another thinks, this is why I must never depend on anyone. The event is the same, a delayed reply, but the story changes the emotional reality. The body does not respond to the delay alone. It responds to the meaning given to the delay. The same is true publicly. A policy can be framed as progress, protection, control, modernization, betrayal, safety, authoritarianism, responsibility, or loss of freedom. The facts require examination, but the narrative gives emotional meaning. The story tells people whether to feel hope, fear, suspicion, pride, anger, relief, urgency, or resistance. The same is true with identity. A childhood wound can become, I was unloved. It can become, I had to become strong. It can become, I am difficult to love. It can become, I see what others do not because I had to survive. It can become, I must never need anyone. It can become, my pain made me deeper. It can become, I am broken. The facts of the wound matter, but the narrative determines the future relationship to that wound. So this episode is not about dismissing stories. We need stories. Without narrative, life would be fragments. Events would not connect. Memory would not cohere. Identity would not stabilize. Communities would not pass meaning through time. Families would not carry history. Cultures would not know what they value. A person would not know how one chapter of life relates to another. A story gives shape. A story gives continuity. A story gives us a way to survive the chaos of experience. But the same story that helps organize reality can also capture it. A narrative can become so emotionally familiar, so identity protective, so socially rewarded, or so morally charged that everything must fit inside it. Evidence is selected to support it. Contradictions are explained away. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. People are assigned fixed roles. Complexity becomes betrayal. Changing the story feels like losing the self. That is narrative capture, and this is where discernment becomes essential. Because we are not only asking, is this story false? Sometimes a story contains real truth. Sometimes it was born from genuine harm, real betrayal, actual injustice, lived experience, careful observation, or historical memory. The issue is not always that the story began as a lie. The issue is whether the story has become total. A story can begin as protection and become a prison. That line will matter throughout this episode. The abandonment story may have begun because someone really was abandoned. The distrust story may have begun because trust really was broken. The decline story may have begun because something really is decaying. The awakening story may have begun because something really was hidden. The injustice story may have begun because harm really happened. The self-protection story may have begun because vulnerability was unsafe. But if the story becomes the only lens, it can begin to organize everything. Every delay becomes abandonment. Every mistake becomes proof of betrayal. Every institution becomes corrupt. Every disagreement becomes an attack. Every doubt becomes weakness. Every criticism becomes oppression. Every correction becomes control. Every complexity becomes contamination. Every person plays a role in the plot. This is when narrative stops helping us see and starts deciding what we are allowed to see. So in this episode, we will explore personal narratives, group narratives, cultural and political narratives, narrative capture, counter-narratives, and the danger of escaping one story only to become possessed by another. We will ask, what story am I inside? Who am I in this story? Who is the villain? Who is the savior? Who is the victim? What ending does this story expect? What facts does this story make visible? What facts does it hide? What would reality look like if the story changed? And perhaps most importantly, am I using this story to understand reality or to protect identity? That is the field we enter today. Part 1. Why we need narrative, meaning coherence and the mind's need for story to understand narrative capture. We first need to understand why narrative exists at all. Narrative is not just fiction. It is not only novels, films, mythology, religion, politics, propaganda, memoirs, or personal testimony. Narrative is the structure of meaning that connects events into a pattern. It tells us what happened, why it happened, who was involved, what role they played, what it means, what may happen next, and how we should orient ourselves. Narrative turns fragments into a world. Without narrative, experience would be overwhelming. Life gives us sensations, memories, encounters, conflicts, losses, hopes, disappointments, images, facts, messages, social cues, bodily signals, and public events. Narrative gathers them. It says, this belongs with that, this caused that, this matters because of that, this person is safe, that person is dangerous, this is progress, that is a decline, this is betrayal, that is love, this is who I am, that is what the world is like. Narrative is how the mind organizes time. It connects past, present, and future. The past becomes memory, the present becomes meaning, and the future becomes expectation. If something painful happened before, the narrative tells us whether it will happen again. If someone betrayed us, the narrative tells us whether people can be trusted. If we succeeded once, the narrative tells us whether we are capable. If we were humiliated, the narrative tells us whether visibility is dangerous. If we were loved, the narrative tells us whether connection is possible. This is why stories are not merely mental. They are bodily. The nervous system responds not only to what is happening now, but to what the story says is happening now. A delayed message can tighten the chest if the story says abandonment is beginning. A raised voice can activate fear if the story says conflict becomes danger. A compliment can create suspicion if the story says kindness is manipulation. A quiet room can feel peaceful if the story says silence is safety, or threatening if the story says silence precedes punishment. The body lives inside the story before the mind has fully articulated it. This is why narrative is so powerful. It gives experienced emotional prediction. It tells the body what to prepare for. We need this because raw experience is too complex. We cannot evaluate every moment from nothing. We rely on patterns. We rely on memory. We rely on meanings built from previous experience. If every encounter had to be interpreted without a story, life would become impossible. Narrative helps us move. It helps us avoid danger. It helps us preserve identity. It helps us explain suffering. It helps us make decisions under uncertainty. But narrative is also selective. It cannot include everything. Every story highlights some facts and leaves others in the background. Every story gives weight to some events and reduces the importance of others. Every story creates roles. Someone becomes the one who hurt us. Someone becomes the one who saved us. Someone becomes the witness. Someone becomes the obstacle. Someone becomes a fool. Someone becomes the authority. Someone becomes the enemy. And often, we become a role too. This is where personal reality begins to form. Imagine a person who has experienced repeated abandonment. The facts are real. People left. Care was inconsistent. Promises were broken. The nervous system learned that closeness can disappear. To survive that, the mind may build a story. People leave. That story may initially protect the person. It helps them scan for signs. It helps them avoid trusting too quickly. It helps them prepare for loss. But if the story becomes total, every ordinary delay may become evidence of abandonment. A partner needing space becomes rejection. A friend being busy becomes proof of decreasing care. A neutral silence becomes dangerous. The story protects the person from being blindsided, but it also prevents them from seeing the difference. It may turn present relationships into reenactments of old wounds. The story began as protection. Then it became a filter. Then it became a prison. This is why discernment asks, is this story helping me see or only helping me cope? That question is compassionate. It does not mock the story. It understands that stories often arise for a reason. People do not usually build survival narratives from nowhere. They build them because something needed explanation. The child needed to understand why love felt unsafe. The adult needed to make sense of betrayal. The group needed to explain suffering. The culture needed to organize fear. The community needed to preserve the memory. Stories can hold pain when pain is too chaotic. But a story that helped us survive one season may not be able to guide us through every future season. A person may carry the story, I have to be strong because no one will come. Perhaps that story was once true. Perhaps no one did come. Perhaps strength was required. But if that story remains absolute, the person may refuse help even when help is available. They may feel shame for needing. They may dismiss care as unreliable. They may build an identity around independence and then feel lonely inside it. Another person may carry the story, I am difficult to love. Perhaps they were treated that way. Perhaps they were shamed for having needs. Perhaps love came with conditions. But if the story becomes identity, the person may interpret tenderness as temporary, conflict as proof, and imperfection as confirmation. They may unconsciously test relationships until the story proves itself again. Narrative is not passive. It shapes behavior. A story about being unlovable may lead someone to withdraw, cling, test, defend, or sabotage. A story about being unsafe may lead someone to control. A story about being special may lead someone to dismiss ordinary wisdom. A story about being always right may lead someone to avoid correction. A story about being a victim may lead someone to miss their own agency. A story about being strong may lead someone to hide pain until the body collapses. This is why narrative is central to reality construction. It not only explains what happened, it influences what happens next. The same applies to groups. A group narrative gives people a shared identity. We are the ones who see. We are the ones who were betrayed. We are the ones protecting truth. We are the ones on the right side. We are the rational ones. We are the compassionate ones. We are the awakened ones. These stories can create solidarity, but they also shape what the group can notice. If the group story says we are always compassionate, then cruelty inside the group becomes harder to see. If the group story says we are always rational, then emotional investment becomes harder to admit. If the group story says they are always dangerous, then complexity on the other side becomes harder to tolerate. Narrative gives belonging, but belonging can depend on keeping the story intact. This is also why cultural narratives are powerful. A society may live inside a story of progress, decline, crisis, restoration, awakening, corruption, liberation, or rescue. These stories organize public emotion. They tell people where to place blame, hope, fear, loyalty, and energy. They give meaning to events before individuals have examined them carefully. Again, the story may contain truth. Societies do decline in some ways. Progress does happen in some ways. Corruption can be real. Liberation can be necessary. A crisis can exist. But when one narrative becomes total, every event is pressed into the same shape. The story becomes a machine, and reality becomes raw material for the machine. This is why narrative must remain open to correction. A healthy narrative can update. It can say, this is what I thought, but now I see more. It can hold contradictions. It can revise roles. It can allow new evidence. It can be admitted that someone who harmed us may also be complex, or that someone we admire may also be wrong, or that a group we belong to may also distort truth, or that a story that once gave meaning may now be too narrow. An unhealthy narrative cannot tolerate revision because the story has become identity. Changing the story feels like death. This is why some people defend narratives with such intensity. They are not defending an idea only. They are defending the world that idea holds together. If the story collapses, the self may have to reorganize. The group may have to face shame. The moral position may become less clear. The future may become uncertain. The enemy may become human. The hero may become flawed. The victim may have agency. The savior may have motives. The plot may no longer be simple. That is emotionally difficult. So people often prefer a painful story that is familiar to a more accurate story that requires uncertainty. Discernment asks us to develop enough inner safety to loosen the story without falling apart. Not to live without narrative. That is impossible. Human beings need a story, but we can become conscious of the story. We can notice when it is helping us organize reality and when it is imprisoning reality. We can ask whether it leaves room for new information, new behavior, new relationships, new possibilities, and new versions of the self. A living story breathes. A captured story hardens. This distinction matters. A living story can carry truth while still evolving. It can honor the past without forcing the future to repeat it. It can cause harm without making identity permanent. It can remember betrayal without making trust impossible. It can recognize danger without turning the whole world into a threat. It can preserve moral concern without reducing people to roles. A captured story cannot do this. It repeats, it predicts, it confirms, it narrows, it assigns, it protects itself. So as we move through this episode, the invitation is not to ask whether stories are good or bad. The invitation is to ask what the story is doing. Does it help me see more? Or does it only help me feel certain? Does it protect my dignity? Or does it protect my identity from correction? Does it honor what happened? Or does it keep me trapped inside what happened? Does it give meaning? Or does it decide reality before reality has a chance to speak? That is where narrative discernment begins. Part 2, Personal Narratives. The story I tell about myself. If narrative turns fragments into a world, then personal narrative turns memory into identity. It is the story we tell about ourselves, not only through words, but through expectation, posture, behavior, emotional reaction, and the roles we keep returning to. A person does not only have memories, they have a narrative about those memories. They carry an interpretation of what happened, why it happened, what it means about them, what it means about other people, and what it means about the future. Over time, that interpretation can become so familiar that it no longer feels like a story. It feels like self. I am always the one who gets left. I have to be strong because no one will come. I am difficult to love. I am the truth teller no one wants to hear. I am behind everyone else. I am broken. I am only valuable when I am useful. I cannot trust comfort because it always disappears. I am awake and others are asleep. I must never need too much. I have to earn my place. These are not just thoughts. They are organizing patterns. They decide what a person notices, how they interpret others, what they expect from life, what kind of relationships feel familiar, and what kind of future feels possible. They also shape the nervous system. The body begins preparing for the world that the story predicts. If my story says I am always abandoned, then distance becomes danger. If my story says I am only safe when I am in control, then uncertainty becomes a threat. If my story says I am not enough, then comparison becomes evidence. If my story says I am the one who sees what others refuse to see, then disagreement may become proof that others are blind. If my story says I am broken, then even healing may be interpreted as something that happens to other people. The story becomes the frame through which the self meets reality. This is why personal narrative can be so powerful and so difficult to loosen. It does not simply live in the mind as an opinion. It lives in memory, emotion, habit, attachment, protection, identity, and bodily expectation. It tells the person who they have been, who they are allowed to become, and what kind of world they are moving through. Often the story began for a reason. This is important. Personal narratives are not usually invented randomly. They are often built from real experience. A person who says, "I am always left," may have been left repeatedly. A person who says, "I have to be strong," may have had no safe place to fall apart. A person who says, "I cannot trust people," may have been betrayed by people who should have protected them. A person who says, "I am difficult to love," may have been made to feel that their needs were too much. A person who says, "I am the truth teller no one wants to hear," may have genuinely named things others refuse to acknowledge. So discernment does not begin by attacking the story. It begins by honoring what the story protected. The story may have helped the person survive. It may have given order to chaos. It may have explained pain. It may have helped them predict danger. It may have protected them from trusting too quickly. It may have helped them stay strong when no one else was available. It may have transformed helplessness into identity. It may have allowed them to continue when the full emotional truth was too overwhelming to feel all at once. A story can be a shelter. But if we live too long inside the shelter, we may mistake it for the whole world. This is where personal narrative becomes captive. A story that once explained a wound begins to organize every new experience around the wound. The person does not only remember abandonment, they anticipate it. They do not only remember being unheard, they enter conversations expecting dismissal. They not only remember being controlled, they interpret guidance as domination. They do not only remember being shamed, they hear correction as rejection. They not only remember being unsafe, they experience openness as danger. The past does not remain in the past. It becomes the plot, and once the plot is active, the self is assigned a role. This is one of the strongest effects of personal narrative. It gives us roles to play. The strong one, the broken one, the rescuer, the abandoned one, the outsider, the misunderstood one, the truth teller, the martyr, the survivor, the rebel, the difficult one, the one who must never need, the one who always has to explain, the one who sees too much, the one who is never chosen, the one who cannot relax because something will go wrong. Some of these roles may contain truth, but when a role becomes fixed, it limits the range of life. The strong one may never receive care. The broken one may never recognize agency. The rescuer may never allow others to take responsibility. The outsider may reject belonging before belonging can reject them. The truth teller may become so attached to exposing that they struggle to listen. The martyr may confuse suffering with love. The rebel may need opposition so strongly that peace feels like a loss of identity. The survivor may continue surviving long after living has become impossible. This is why the question matters. What role do I keep playing in my own story? Not because the role is false, but because it may have become too small for the life that is now trying to emerge. A personal narrative can also become self-confirming. If a person believes they will be abandoned, they may become hypervigilant at a distance. Their fear may lead them to protest, withdraw, test, accuse, or cling. The other person may feel pressured, confused, or mistrusted, and may eventually pull away. The original story then says, "See, people leave." The story created behaviors that made its own confirmation more likely. This can happen with many narratives. If I believe I am not valued, I may stop asking clearly for what I need, and then feel unseen. If I believe people cannot handle my truth, I may speak with defensive force, and then experience others as rejecting the truth rather than reacting to the force. If I believe I must be perfect to be loved, I may hide my flaws, and then feel lonely because no one knows me. If I believe authority always controls, I may resist guidance, even when guidance is helpful. If I believe I am always the victim, I may miss where I have power. If I believe I am always the rational one, I may miss where I am emotionally defensive. The story becomes active. It does not merely describe behavior. It produces behavior, and then the behavior produces more evidence for the story. This is narrative capture at the personal level. Again, this does not mean the story is simply wrong. The person may have genuine evidence. They may have lived through things that make the narrative understandable. But the question is whether the story still allows reality to surprise it. Can something new happen? Can someone behave differently? Can the self respond differently? Can the story update when evidence changes? Can the person become more than the role? If the answer is no, the narrative has become a cage. One of the clearest signs of personal narrative capture is when every new experience gets absorbed into the same old meaning. A kind gesture becomes suspicious because the story says kindness is manipulation. A disagreement becomes abandonment because the story says conflict leads to loss. A mistake becomes proof of worthlessness because the story says failure defines the self. A period of uncertainty becomes doom because the story says safety never lasts. A success becomes temporary because the story says good things are never truly for me. The story explains everything too quickly. It closes the field before discernment has time to examine the present moment. This is why we need to ask, does this story leave room for change? A living narrative can say, I was abandoned, and I am learning to recognize people who stay. A captured narrative says, people always leave. A living narrative says, I had to be strong, and now I am learning to receive support. A captured narrative says, no one will ever come. A living narrative says, I was harmed, and I am reclaiming agency. A captured narrative says, my harm is my entire identity. A living narrative says, I have seen things others dismissed, and I must remain humble. A captured narrative says, I am awake, and others are blind. A living narrative honors the past without forcing the future to repeat it. A captured narrative keeps the future loyal to the wound. This is especially important in healing work. Healing often begins by naming the story. A person finally says, "This happened to me. It shaped me. It hurt me. It taught me to protect myself in this way." That is powerful. It can be liberating. Naming the story can end years of confusion. It can help the body understand why it reacts as it does. It can restore dignity. But there is a second stage. After the story is named, eventually it must become flexible. If the person remains fused with the wound narrative, healing can become another identity. They may become the traumatized one, the abandoned one, the inner child who was broken, the person no one understood, and while those descriptions may hold truth, they cannot be the final form of the self. A wound may explain part of us. It must not be allowed to own all of us. This is where narrative work becomes delicate. If we rush too quickly to change the story, we may bypass pain. We may invalidate the wound. We may pressure someone into positivity before the truth has been honored. But if we never allow the story to evolve, we may trap the person in permanent injury. Discernment holds both. The wound was real, and the wound is not the whole self. The story protected me, and the story may now be limiting me. The role helped me survive, and I may be ready to become more than the role. This does not happen through denial. It happens through widening. We do not simply replace one story with a prettier one. We add missing truth. If the story says, "I was abandoned," the widening does not say, "No, you were not." It may say, "I was abandoned and I also found ways to survive. I was left and I also learned to recognize absence. I was not protected and now I am learning to protect myself differently." Some people left and some people may not. My body expects loss, but the present deserves examination. If the story says, "I am difficult to love," the widening does not say, "Everything is fine." It may say, "Some people made it difficult for me to love. My needs were treated as burdens," but that does not prove I am unlovable. It may prove that I was surrounded by people with limited capacity. I can learn to bring my needs into relationships with more clarity. I can learn to receive love without testing it into collapse. If the story says, "I have to be strong," the widening may say, "Strength saved me." But strength is not the only form of dignity. Receiving care is not a weakness. Rest is not failure. I can be strong enough to stop performing strength. This is how narrative evolves, not by erasing the old story, but by making it less total. Personal narratives can also be shaped by culture. Many people inherit stories before they know they are stories. Stories about gender, success, masculinity, femininity, class, intelligence, beauty, aging, family loyalty, emotional control, national identity, spirituality, work, money, morality, and worth. A man may carry the story that needing comfort makes him weak. A woman may carry the story that being desirable is central to being valued. A working class person may carry the story that intellectual spaces are not for them. A successful person may carry the story that stopping means becoming worthless. A spiritual person may carry the story that anger means they are not evolved. A parent may carry the story that sacrifice is love. These inherited narratives become personal because they enter the body early. They shape what feels possible. They shape what feels shameful. They shape what we try to become and what we fear being seen as. This is why the question, "Who would I be if this story softened?" can be so powerful. If the story of always being strong softened, perhaps I could ask for help. If the story of being behind softened, perhaps I could move at my own pace. If the story of being broken softened, perhaps I could see myself as healing rather than ruined. If the story of being the truth teller softened, perhaps I could listen without needing to expose. If the story of being unwanted softened, perhaps I could receive love without suspicion. If the story of being awake softened, perhaps I could remain discerning without needing superiority. If the story of needing to perform softened, perhaps I could be more human. The self is not destroyed when the story softens. Often the self becomes more available. Personal narrative discernment, therefore, asks several questions. What story do I keep telling about myself? What role does that story assign to me? What does it help me see? What does it prevent me from seeing? What evidence does it ignore? What behavior does it make feel necessary? What future does it expect? Does it leave room for change? And what would become possible if the story became less absolute? These questions are not easy because stories carry emotional loyalty. We may feel loyal to our wounds, loyal to our survival strategies, loyal to the identity that formed around pain, loyal to the version of ourselves that endured. Changing the story can feel like betraying the self that survived. But it is not betrayal to grow beyond a survival narrative. It is a continuation of survival into life. The story that protected the child may need to be honored, but the adult may need a wider map. The story that helped us make sense of betrayal may need to be respected, but future intimacy may require more flexibility. The story that made us strong may need gratitude, but wholeness may require softness too. A personal narrative is not something to destroy. It is something to bring into consciousness, because once we can see the story, we are no longer only inside it. We can relate to it. We can question it. We can update it. We can thank it. We can loosen it. We can ask whether it still serves truth or only protects a familiar identity. That is the beginning of freedom from narrative capture, not freedom from story, freedom within the story. The ability to say, "This is the story I have lived inside, but it is not the only story reality is allowed to become." Part 3, Group Narratives, us, them, heroes, villains, and belonging. If personal narratives tell us who we are inside our own memories, group narratives tell us who we are with others. They give people a shared story, a shared identity, a shared map of meaning. They tell members who we are, who they are, what happened to us, what threatens us, what makes us righteous, what we must protect, what we must resist, and what kind of future we are supposed to move towards. We do not only need individual meaning, we need shared meaning. That is why group narratives are so powerful. A person may feel uncertain alone, but inside a group story they know who they are. They know the language, they know the symbols, they know the villains, they know the heroes, they know the wounds, they know the slogans, they know what counts as loyalty, they know what counts as betrayal, they know what kind of emotional response is expected. The story becomes a home for identity. This can be deeply stabilizing. Groups can preserve memory, protect people from isolation, organize collective action, expose injustice, transmit wisdom, build solidarity, and give people courage. A person who feels alone in their pain may find a community that finally names it. A person who has been dismissed may find a group that validates their experience. A person who has been confused by a system may find others who can help them see the pattern. A shared narrative can restore dignity. So the issue is not that groups tell stories. All groups tell stories. The issue is what happens when the story becomes more important than reality. Group narratives usually contain roles. There is the us and the them. There is often a hero, a victim, a villain, a traitor, a fool, a savior, an oppressor, a corrupted institution, a sleeping public, an awakened minority, a dangerous outsider, or a pure inner circle. These roles help the group organize complexity. They simplify the social world so members know where to place trust, anger, hope, and suspicion. A political group may tell a story of decline and rescue. The country is being lost. We are the ones who understand the danger. They are destroying what matters. A strong response is needed. Another political group may tell a story of liberation and progress. Old structures are harmful. We are the ones moving history forward. They are defending oppression. Transformation is necessary. Both narratives may contain fragments of truth. Both may also simplify reality into moral roles that become hard to question. A spiritual group may tell a story of awakening. We see what others cannot. We are raising consciousness. They are trapped in ego, fear, density, programming, or lower awareness. This can give people a sense of meaning and hope, but it can also create superiority. Once the group sees itself as awakened, critique from outside can be dismissed as evidence of lower consciousness. Doubt from inside can be interpreted as ego resistance. The story protects itself by assigning spiritual status to agreement. An activist group may tell a story of harm and justice. We are naming what has been hidden. They are causing harm. Silence is complicity. Action proves moral seriousness. This can be necessary when injustice has been ignored. But if the narrative hardens, the group may begin rewarding intensity over accuracy, purity over repair, and visible outrage over effective change. The story of justice can become a hierarchy of moral belonging. A family may tell a story of sacrifice and loyalty. We did our best. Family sticks together. We do not air dirty laundry. You should be grateful. We survived. This story may preserve connection and recognize real hardship, but it can also silence truth. If loyalty becomes the highest value, then the person naming harm may be cast as a betrayer. The family story does not need to prove they are wrong. It only needs to make their honesty feel disloyal. A workplace may tell a story of excellence and resilience. We are high-performing. We go the extra mile. We do what others cannot. Pressure is part of greatness. This story can create pride and dedication. It can also normalize burnout. The person who questions the pace becomes weak. The person who sets boundaries becomes less committed. The person who names dysfunction becomes negative. The organizational story converts extraction into virtue. An online community may tell a story of seeing what others cannot. We are not fooled. We know the hidden truth. The mainstream is asleep. Outsiders cannot understand because they are programmed. This story can sometimes help people challenge dominant assumptions, but it can also create narrative immunity. If evidence supports the story, it is proof. If evidence challenges the story, it is proof of the cover-up. The story becomes impossible to falsify because every contradiction is absorbed into the plot. This is the first danger of group narrative. It can decide what members are allowed to notice. A group story gives people belonging, but belonging often comes with perception rules. Certain facts can be spoken. Certain facts are inconvenient. Certain emotions are encouraged. Certain emotions are suspicious. Certain questions are welcome. Certain questions threaten membership. Certain doubts are treated as maturity. Others are treated as betrayal. Every group has a boundary around its story. Inside that boundary, people feel safe. Outside it, they may feel exposed. This is why group narratives can be emotionally powerful, even when they distort reality. Belonging regulates the nervous system. To share a story with others is to feel less alone. The group says, "You are not mad. You are not imagining it. We see it too." That can be healing when the group is naming something real, but it can become dangerous if the need for belonging becomes stronger than the commitment to truth. Because then the person may begin protecting the group story in order to protect their place inside the group. They may stop asking questions. They may ignore contradictions. They may repeat phrases they have not fully examined. They may perform the expected emotional response. They may exaggerate certainty because hesitation lowers rank. They may become afraid to speak nuance because nuance sounds like disloyalty. This is how group narrative becomes social control. Not always through obvious authoritarianism, often through subtle emotional rules. If you belong, you understand. If you question, you are suspect. If you complicate the story, you are making excuses. If you ask for evidence, you are missing the point. If you disagree, you must be one of them. The group does not have to imprison the body if it can capture the need to belong. This is why discernment must ask, what story does this group tell about itself? Does it tell the story of being the compassionate ones, the rational ones, the awakened ones, the oppressed ones, the chosen ones, the rebellious ones, the pure ones, the brave ones, the intelligent ones, the traumatized ones, the only ones who see, the only ones who care? Then ask, what does that story make visible? A group that sees itself as compassionate may notice harm more quickly. A group that sees itself as rational may notice emotional manipulation. A group that sees itself as awakened may notice hidden patterns. A group that sees itself as oppressed may notice power. A group that sees itself as rebellious may notice conformity. These are not necessarily false strengths. The group story may train attention towards something valuable. But then ask, what does the story hide? The compassionate group may hide its own cruelty. The rational group may hide its emotional investment. The awakened group may hide its arrogance. The oppressed group may hide its capacity to harm. The rebellious group may hide its own conformity. The morally clean group may hide its need for status. The truth-seeking group may hide the ways it protects its favorite conclusions. Every story gives sight in one direction and blindness in another. A discerning person learns to respect what the group story reveals without becoming captured by what it conceals. This is not easy, because group identity creates emotional pressure. When a group gives us language for pain, it can feel dangerous to question the group. When it gives us belonging after isolation, questioning can feel like risking exile. When it gives us moral clarity, questioning can feel like losing goodness. When it gives us an enemy, questioning can feel like weakening the cause. When it gives us a role, questioning can feel like losing ourselves. Group narratives are powerful because they meet real human needs. They give orientation. They give emotional validation. They give social protection. They give shared purpose. They give status. They explain. They give a sense of being part of something larger. That is why simply telling people, you are trapped in a story, rarely works. They may hear it as an attack on the belonging that holds them together. The story is not just an idea. It is a relational home. To question it may feel like becoming homeless. This is why narrative discernment requires compassion. We do not examine group stories in order to sneer at people for needing belonging. We examine them because belonging without discernment can become captivity. The task is not to have a group. That is not human. The task is to belong without surrendering perception. Can I be part of a community and still ask questions? Can I share a cause and still notice when the cause becomes distorted? Can I honor my group's pain without turning outsiders into permanent villains? Can I recognize real injustice without making my side morally untouchable? Can I value solidarity without abandoning conscience? Can I remain connected while still seeing complexity? These are difficult questions because they require maturity. They require the ability to tolerate tension. The group may not always reward that. Groups often prefer simplicity because simplicity binds more easily. A clear enemy binds. A clear hero binds. A clear wound binds. A clear mission binds. Complexity loosens the emotional charge. It slows mobilization. It asks people to hold contradictions. It makes slogans less satisfying. But truth often lives in the contradictions the group story cannot easily hold. A group may be harmed and still harmful. A leader may be insightful and still manipulative. A movement may name real injustice and still produce new forms of domination. A family may have sacrificed and still cause damage. An institution may be corrupt in some ways and functional in others. A public figure may be wrong about one thing and right about another. A community may be healing for some and controlling for others. Narrative capture wants fixed roles. Discernment asks for living reality. One of the strongest signs of group narrative capture is when people become more committed to defending the story than understanding the situation. When every event is immediately placed into the same plot. When the group already knows who is guilty before examining the evidence. When every criticism from outside is dismissed as an attack. When every criticism from inside is treated as betrayal. When the group cannot say, we were wrong, without collapsing. A healthy group can revise its story. An unhealthy group must protect itself. This does not mean healthy groups have no boundaries. Some criticism is bad faith. Some opposition is manipulative. Some outsiders genuinely do not understand. Some groups need shared values to exist. But a healthy group can distinguish between an attack that seeks to destroy and a question that seeks clarity. An unhealthy group treats both as the same because both threaten the narrative. So the discerning questions become, who must be protected for this story to remain intact? Who must be blamed? What facts are inconvenient? What questions threaten belonging? Who benefits from the group continuing to see itself this way? Who loses voice because the story has already assigned them a role? And what would happen if the group admitted complexity? These questions matter because group narratives shape not only belief, but behavior. If the story says outsiders are dangerous, members may justify cruelty. If the story says we are uniquely enlightened, members may ignore accountability. If the story says we are constantly under attack, members may become defensive, even when feedback is valid. If the story says our leader is chosen, members may excuse harm. If the story says our suffering makes us pure, members may struggle to see their own power. The narrative gives permission. This is why collective stories can become morally charged. Once the group story becomes sacred, protecting it can feel like protecting truth itself. People may lie to defend what they believe is a higher truth. They may silence dissent to protect unity. They may shame individuals to protect the cause. They may excuse harm because the enemy is worse. They may refuse correction because correction feels like weakening the story. This is where episode 11 begins to lead towards episode 12. When narrative becomes morally fused, certainty can replace humility. The story becomes more than an explanation. It becomes righteousness. But before we get there, the key insight for this part is simple. Group narratives give belonging by organizing reality, but they can also capture perception by deciding what belonging requires us not to see. A mature relationship to group narrative does not demand isolation. It asks us to remain conscious of belonging, to listen to the group story but not be swallowed by it, to honor shared pain but not turn pain into permanent permission, to value solidarity but not at the cost of truth, to belong without giving the group ownership over perception, because a group story can help us find our people, but discernment must help us remain human once we do. Part 4: Cultural and political narratives: decline, progress, crisis, awakening and rescue. If personal narratives organize the self, and group narratives organize belonging, then cultural and political narratives organize collective reality. They tell whole populations what kind of moment they are living through, what kind of future is approaching, what kind of past has been lost, who should be trusted, who should be feared, and what kind of action is required. These narratives do not merely describe events, they arrange public emotion around events. A society does not only respond to facts, it responds to the story that those facts are placed inside. The same economic change, the same technology, the same policy, the same protest, the same conflict, the same scientific development, the same social trend can be interpreted through very different public stories. One narrative calls it progress, another calls it a decline. One calls it safety, another calls it control. One calls it liberation, another calls it chaos. One calls it modernization, another calls it a loss. One calls it awakening, another calls it radicalization. The event matters, evidence matters, but the narrative tells the public what the event means. This is why cultural and political narratives are so powerful. They not only influence opinion, they shape the emotional atmosphere in which opinion forms. They tell people whether to feel hope, fear, pride, suspicion, shame, urgency, resentment, moral certainty, nostalgia, or the need for rescue. One of the most common public narratives is the narrative of decline. The decline story says, things are falling apart. Something valuable has been lost. The present is weaker, more corrupt, more confused, more dangerous, more degraded, or more empty than the past. The culture is decaying. Institutions are failing. People are becoming softer, more selfish, less moral, less connected, less capable, and less human. The future is not an opening, it is a threat. This narrative can contain real truth. Some things do decline. Institutions can decay. Cultural standards can erode. Communities can fragment. Technology can damage attention. Public trust can collapse. Families can weaken. Human beings can lose touch with practices that once grounded them. A decline narrative may name genuine loss, but if decline becomes total, it can make hope feel naive. It can turn every new development into evidence of collapse. It can make people romanticize the past, simplify history, and search for enemies who supposedly caused the fall. It can make restoration feel like salvation, even when the past being restored never truly existed in the clean form imagined. The decline story gives grief a direction, but it can also turn grief into resentment. Another common narrative is the narrative of progress. The progress story says, history is moving forward. We are becoming more advanced, more inclusive, more rational, more free, more connected, more technologically capable, more enlightened, more humane. The old world was limited, prejudiced, inefficient, superstitious, oppressive, or backward. The future is improvement. This story can also contain the real truth. Progress exists. Some old structures were cruel. Some traditions protected hierarchy more than wisdom. Medical, technological, social, and legal developments have improved many lives. People have gained rights, protections, knowledge, and opportunities that previous generations did not have. But if progress becomes total, it can make caution feel regressive. It can treat every new thing as an improvement simply because it is new. It can dismiss inherited wisdom as backwardness. It can frame dissent as ignorance. It can ignore the costs of acceleration. It can be assumed that whatever is technologically possible must be socially desirable. It can make people forget that movement is not the same as maturity. The progress story gives hope a direction, but it can also turn hope into blind momentum. Then there is the crisis narrative. The crisis story says immediate action is required. There is no time for hesitation. The situation is urgent. Delay is dangerous. Those who question the response are irresponsible, naive, selfish, dangerous, or complicit. Crisis narratives are powerful because they mobilize quickly. They narrow attention. They organize public behavior around threat. Sometimes crisis narratives are necessary. Real emergencies exist. Delayed action can cause harm. A society that cannot respond to a genuine crisis becomes fragile. But crisis language is also one of the easiest ways to suspend discernment. When everything is urgent, reflection becomes dangerous. When every question is framed as a delay, accountability weakens. When fear becomes the organizing state, people may accept measures they would examine more carefully in calmer conditions. A crisis can reveal what matters. It can also be used to bypass what matters. A related narrative is the rescue narrative. The rescue story says, someone or something will save us. A leader, a policy, a movement, a technology, a revolution, a spiritual awakening, a market solution, a political party, a new system, a new expert class, a return to tradition, a dismantling of tradition. The rescue narrative offers relief because uncertainty is exhausting. People want to believe there is an answer, a savior, a plan, a figure, a method, a side, or a future that will resolve the tension. Rescue stories can be motivating. They can help people organize around change, but they can also transfer agency away from the individual and the community. People may wait for the leader, the system, the next election, the next innovation, the next revelation, the next guru, the next movement, the next collapse, the next awakening. The story promises that something outside the self will complete the meaning. This can make people highly suggestible to charismatic figures and totalizing ideologies. If someone can position themselves as the rescuer inside a frightened or exhausted public narrative, they inherit enormous emotional power. Then there is the betrayal narrative. The betrayal story says, we were lied to, we were deceived, we trusted the wrong people. The institutions, leaders, media, experts, family, partner, group, or culture misled us. Betrayal narratives can be important. They can expose deception. They can restore justified suspicion where trust was abused. They can help people stop being naive. But if betrayal becomes total, trust itself becomes almost impossible. Every mistake becomes deliberate deception. Every uncertainty becomes proof of a hidden motive. Every institution becomes corrupt by default. Every disagreement becomes complicity. Every absence of evidence becomes evidence of concealment. The person or group may feel awake, but they may also become trapped in a world where nothing can be trusted except the story of betrayal itself. The betrayal story can free people from false trust. It can also imprison them inside suspicion. The awakening narrative is similar. It says, people are finally seeing. The veil is lifting. The illusion is breaking. We are leaving sleep and entering truth. This narrative can be powerful because it gives meaning to disillusionment. It names the feeling of seeing through something that once seemed normal. It can help people leave manipulation, indoctrination, denial, or unconscious conformity. But awakening can become a status symbol. If I am awake, others are asleep. If I see, others are blind. If I question, others are programmed. The story creates elevation. It gives identity to perception. And once awakening becomes identity, humility becomes harder. The person may stop asking whether they are seeing clearly and begin assuming that feeling awake proves clarity. The awakening story can open perception. It can also make perception arrogant. Political narratives often combine these structures. A movement may use decline, betrayal, crisis, and rescue all at once. The country is falling apart. You have been lied to, the danger is urgent, and only this leader or movement can save it. Another movement may use progress, liberation, crisis, and moral rescue. Society is evolving. Oppressive structures must be dismantled. Delay causes harm, and only this transformation can deliver justice. The emotional architecture may differ, but the narrative mechanism is similar. The story tells people what moment they are in, who they are within it, who threatens the future, and what action is required. This is why discernment has to ask, what larger story is this message asking me to join? A single message rarely stands alone. A headline, speech, advert, campaign, sermon, documentary, social post, or public statement usually enters a larger story. It may be inviting you into decline, progress, crisis, awakening, betrayal, rescue, restoration, liberation, corruption, security, or freedom. Once you identify the larger story, you can begin to examine it. What does this story make visible? What does it hide? What emotion does it produce? What behavior does it make feel necessary? Who benefits if this is the dominant narrative? What facts would complicate it? What kind of person does it invite me to become? A narrative of security, for example, may make danger visible. That can be useful, but it may hide the cost of control. A narrative of freedom may make autonomy visible, but it may hide the cost of irresponsibility. A narrative of compassion may make suffering visible, but it may hide the need for boundaries. A narrative of justice may make harm visible, but it may hide the danger of revenge. A narrative of progress may make possibility visible, but it may hide unintended consequences. A narrative of decline may make loss visible, but it may hide what is still growing. Every narrative reveals and conceals. This is one of the most important principles of narrative discernment. No public story captures the whole of reality. It cannot. It selects. It organizes. It gives weight. It creates roles. It guides emotion. Even a truthful narrative remains partial. That does not make all narratives equal. Some are more honest, more evidence-based, more humane, more proportionate, more accountable, and more open to correction than others. But even the best story needs humility. The danger begins when a narrative becomes total, sacred, or immune to challenge. In cultural life, these stories can shape what counts as common sense. A society living inside a progress narrative may treat resistance as irrational. A society living inside a decline narrative may treat hope as delusion. A society living inside a crisis narrative may treat patience as irresponsibility. A society living inside a betrayal narrative may treat trust as stupidity. A society living inside a rescue narrative may treat complexity as an obstruction. The narrative defines the emotional meaning of thought itself. In a crisis story, thinking slowly may feel immoral. In an awakening story, doubt may feel like going back to sleep. In a progress story, caution may feel like sabotage. In a decline story, optimism may feel like denial. In a betrayal story, trust may feel like weakness. This is how narratives regulate the boundaries of acceptable perception. The same policy or event can look completely different depending on the story. Consider a new digital system introduced by an institution. In a progress narrative, it is modernization. In a security narrative, it is protection. In a convenience narrative, it is efficiency. In a control narrative, it is surveillance. In a decline narrative, it is another sign that human contact is being lost. In a betrayal narrative, it is evidence that institutions cannot be trusted. In a rescue narrative, it is the solution to outdated systems. The actual system still has to be examined. How does it work? Who benefits? Who is excluded? What data is collected? What safeguards exist? What alternatives remain? What are the real advantages and risks? But the narrative will decide which questions feel natural to ask. That is why narrative can shape reality before evidence is weighed. Not by inventing everything, but by deciding what matters first. This is also why public debate often becomes so heated. People are not only arguing about a specific issue, they are defending the story that gives the issue meaning. To challenge the policy may feel like challenging progress. To support the policy may feel like supporting control. To ask for nuance may feel like weakening justice. To name risk may feel like spreading fear. To question authority may feel like protecting freedom or endangering safety, depending on the narrative. People think they are debating facts, but often they are defending worlds. A narrative is a world. It has heroes, villains, victims, threats, promises, symbols, language, rituals, emotional tones, and expected endings. If the narrative is strong enough, people can begin filtering every fact through it. This is why cultural and political narratives have to be handled carefully. Without them, collective life becomes fragmented. With them, collective life can become captured. We need shared stories, but we need stories that remain answerable to reality. A healthy public narrative can say, here is a pattern, but we must keep testing it. Here is a danger, but we must remain proportionate. Here is a hope, but we must examine costs. Here is an injustice, but we must not abandon truth. Here is a tradition, but we must not romanticize harm. Here is a change, but we must not worship novelty. Here is a betrayal, but we must not become incapable of trust. Here is a crisis, but we must not let urgency erase accountability. An unhealthy narrative cannot speak this way. It needs certainty. It needs enemies. It needs loyalty. It needs emotional simplicity. It needs the plot to continue. This is where discernment becomes almost civic. It is not only personal. It is not only relational. It is a public responsibility to ask whether the stories we share are making us more truthful or merely more mobilized. Because narratives can mobilize people towards courage, repair, justice, and wisdom. They can also mobilize people towards fear, obedience, cruelty, contempt, and self-deception. The story matters. So when we encounter cultural and political narratives, the practice is not to reject the story. It is to slow the story down, to ask what it selects, what it omits. It depends on the emotion. What role does it assign to us? What future does it promise or threaten? What kind of action does it demand? What kind of people does it teach us to become? Because the story that organizes public reality eventually enters private bodies. People carry the cultural narrative in their nervous systems. They wake up feeling decline, crisis, progress, betrayal, awakening, rescue, or doom. They talk to their families through it. They judge neighbors through it. They vote through it. They buy through it. They fear through it. They hope through it. They raise children through it. A public story becomes an intimate atmosphere. And that is why narrative discernment is not optional. It is one of the ways we protect perception from becoming a servant of someone else's plot. Part 5: Narrative Capture. When the story becomes more important than reality. If cultural and political narratives organize public reality, then narrative capture is what happens when the story becomes more important than reality itself. This is the point where a narrative stops being a tool for understanding and starts becoming a prison of interpretation. It does not necessarily mean the story is entirely false. In fact, many captured narratives contain real facts, real wounds, real patterns, real betrayals, real dangers, real injustices, or real observations. That is often what makes them so powerful. A story that contains no truth is usually easier to challenge. A story that contains partial truth can become much harder to loosen, because the real part protects the totalizing part. Narrative capture does not always deny facts. Sometimes it selects, arranges, and interprets facts until only one story can survive. That is the key distinction. A captured narrative may allow evidence, but only evidence that supports the plot. It may allow questions, but only questions that keep the story intact. It may allow complexity, but only if complexity can eventually be folded back into the original meaning. It may appear open to reality, but reality is only accepted when it plays the assigned role. This can happen personally, relationally, politically, spiritually, culturally, and publicly. It can happen inside an individual's life, inside a family, inside a movement, inside a workplace, inside a community, inside a nation, or inside a digital audience. The scale changes, but the structure remains the same. A story forms. The story gives meaning. The meaning gives identity. The identity becomes emotionally protected. Then reality is forced to fit. At first, the story may help. A person who has been betrayed may need the story, I was deceived. A group that has been harmed may need the story, this injustice happened. A society facing institutional failure may need the story, something is corrupt. A person who has lived under manipulation may need the story, "My perception was being shaped." These stories can restore sanity. They can name what was previously denied. They can help people stop blaming themselves. They can organize truth. But then the story can harden. The betrayed person begins seeing betrayal everywhere. The harmed group begins treating every disagreement as further harm. The person who discovered corruption begins interpreting every uncertainty as corruption. The person who escaped manipulation begins seeing manipulation in every uncomfortable exchange. The narrative that once restored perception begins controlling perception. This is narrative capture. One sign of capture is when contradiction is reframed as proof of the story. A person with an abandonment narrative may say, "They replied warmly because they feel guilty about leaving." If the reply is delayed, it proves abandonment. If the reply is warm, it proves hidden abandonment. If the person asks for space, it proves abandonment. If the person offers closeness, it proves they are trying to cover abandonment. The story can explain every outcome, which means no outcome can challenge it. A political narrative may do the same. If evidence supports the story, it is proof. If evidence challenges the story, it is dismissed as propaganda. If no evidence appears, the lack of evidence becomes proof of concealment. If someone disagrees, they are asleep, compromised, naive, malicious, privileged, brainwashed, or part of the problem. The narrative cannot be tested because every test has already been absorbed. When a story can explain everything, it may no longer be explaining. It may be capturing. Another sign is fixed roles. Once narrative capture takes hold, people stop being complex and become characters. Villain, victim, savior, traitor, fool, enabler, oppressor, rescuer, awakened one, sleeping one, pure one, corrupt one, loyal one, dangerous one. The human being becomes less important than the role the story needs them to play. This happens in families. One person is the difficult one. Another is the responsible one. One is fragile. Another is selfish. One is successful. Another is a disappointment. Once these roles harden, new evidence struggles to enter. The difficult person can speak carefully and still be heard as trouble. The responsible person can act selfishly and still be protected by their role. The fragile person can control the whole room and still be treated as powerless. The story is not describing the family anymore. It is organizing the family. It happens in relationships. One partner becomes the rational one, the other the emotional one. One becomes the hurt one, the other the harmful one. One becomes the one who always tries, the other the one who never understands. Sometimes these roles reflect real patterns, but if they become fixed, the relationship loses the ability to update. The rational one cannot see their avoidance. The emotional one cannot be heard accurately. The hurt one cannot be accountable. The harmful one cannot change. The story becomes stronger than the living relationship. It happens in public controversies. A clip appears. A screenshot appears. A statement appears. Then the roles arrive: villain, victim, hypocrite, hero, manipulator, truth teller, coward, martyr, grifter. Everyone begins arguing from the role assignment. Evidence is no longer examined slowly. It is processed according to the story each audience member has already joined. The event becomes less important than the story people need the event to prove. This is why narrative capture is so difficult to interrupt. The story is not merely cognitive. It is emotional. It gives people a place to stand. It tells them who they are, what they know, what they should feel, who they should trust, and what they should do next. It reduces ambiguity. It gives energy. It gives belonging. It gives moral direction. To question the story can feel like losing the world. This is why people may react so strongly when their narrative is challenged. They may not hear a challenge to a claim. They may feel a threat to identity, memory, belonging, morality, or safety. If the story has become the structure holding pain together, then loosening the story can feel like risking emotional collapse. For example, someone whose life narrative is "I am the one no one ever sees" may experience care in a complicated way. If someone genuinely sees them, the story is challenged. That could be healing, but it may also feel destabilizing. The person may mistrust the care, test it, dismiss it, or search for evidence that it is not real. Not because they want pain, but because the story is familiar. Familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar safety. The same applies to group narratives. A group that sees itself as uniquely compassionate may resist evidence of its own cruelty because that evidence threatens the group's identity. A group that sees itself as rational may resist evidence of emotional bias. A group that sees itself as oppressed may resist evidence that it can also hold power. A group that sees itself as awake may resist evidence that it has become arrogant. The story protects the group from shame. Narrative capture often functions as shame management. The story keeps the self or group clean. It explains why we are right, why they are wrong, why our pain matters most, why our actions are justified, why our contradictions are exceptions, why our side should be trusted, and why their side should be feared. This does not mean all moral clarity is false. Some situations do require clear judgment. Some behaviors are abusive. Some systems are corrupt. Some people lie. Some groups harm. Some dangers are real. Discernment is not endless ambiguity. But the presence of real harm does not remove the need to remain honest about the story we are building around it. Because once the story becomes sacred, almost anything can be justified in its defense. Another sign of narrative capture is when complexity feels like betrayal. If someone says there may be more to this, the captured field hears you are weakening the story. If someone asks for evidence, the captured field hears you do not care. If someone asks whether both sides contributed, the captured field hears, you are blaming the victim. If someone says a leader did something wrong, the captured field hears, you are helping the enemy. If someone questions a group's tactics, the captured field hears, you are against the cause. In a captured narrative, nuance becomes morally dangerous. This is a serious problem because reality is often complex. To admit complexity is not to abandon ethics. It is to serve truth. But if the narrative depends on clean roles, complexity threatens the plot. It makes the villain more human, the hero more flawed, the victim more agentic, the group more accountable, the enemy less simple, and the self less innocent. Narrative capture resists this because the simple story is emotionally efficient. It tells us what to feel without delay. But discernment often requires delay. It requires us to ask what is known, what is inferred, what is assumed, what is emotionally satisfying, what role has been assigned, what evidence is missing, and what the story makes difficult to see. A practical question here is, what would count as evidence against this story? If the answer is nothing, then we are not dealing with an open narrative. We are dealing with a closed system. This question is powerful because it tests whether the story remains answerable to reality. If no evidence could challenge it, then the narrative has become immune. It has stopped being a way of understanding and become a way of protecting itself. In personal life, this might look like asking, what would show me that this person is not abandoning me? What would show me that I am not always powerless? What would show me that I can be loved without performing? What would show me that not every conflict is a danger? What would show me that I am more than my wound? In group life, what would show us that our side made a mistake? What would show us that our leader is not beyond criticism? What would show us that our opponents are not all malicious? What would show us that our preferred narrative is incomplete? In public life, what would show that this issue is more complex than the dominant story? What evidence would change my view? What fact would I not want to be true because it would disrupt my moral position? These are uncomfortable questions, but discomfort is often the doorway out of capture. Another important question is, who benefits if this story remains dominant? A story may benefit leaders, institutions, influencers, platforms, political actors, families, communities, or the self-image of the group. A family story may benefit the parent whose behavior remains unquestioned. A workplace story may benefit leadership by turning overwork into loyalty. A political story may benefit those who gain power by keeping fear alive. A media story may benefit those who monetize conflict. A spiritual story may benefit the teacher whose authority becomes sacred. A personal story may benefit the ego by avoiding vulnerability, accountability, or change. This does not mean the story is automatically false, but the benefit tells us why the story may be defended so fiercely. Narrative capture also makes people selective with compassion. The story decides who deserves empathy. The victim within the story receives care. The villain receives contempt. The in-group receives context. The out-group receives judgment. The admired leader receives forgiveness. The disliked person receives no benefit of the doubt. The self receives justification. The other receives blame. This selective compassion is one of the clearest signs that the story has overtaken reality. True discernment tries to see more evenly. It can still make judgments. It can still hold boundaries. It can still cause harm. But it does not allow narrative role assignment to decide in advance who is human. This matters because dehumanization often begins narratively. A person or group is first turned into a symbol of threat, corruption, stupidity, evil, fragility, backwardness, contamination, or danger. Once they become a symbol, real human complexity disappears. Then harsh treatment becomes easier to justify. The story prepares the permission. This is why we have to be careful with repeated labels. Labels can be useful when precise, but when labels become narrative shortcuts, they can replace perception. Narcissist, sheep, woke, bigot, conspiracy theorist, toxic, evil, snowflake, elitist, abuser, oppressor, traitor, brainwashed. These words may sometimes point towards real patterns, but they can also become role assignments that end inquiry. The label says, I already know what this person is. Discernment asks, what is actually happening? Again, this does not mean abandoning judgment. It means resisting premature narrative closure. Narrative capture can also happen through hope, not only fear and anger. A rescue narrative can capture people by promising that everything will finally make sense. A movement will save us. A leader will restore us. Technology will solve us. A spiritual awakening will transform us. A collapse will cleanse us. A new system will redeem us. Hope can become captive when it makes people surrender agency to the promised ending. The story says, wait for the resolution, but life requires participation before the ending arrives. This is why narrative capture can feel comforting, even when it is painful. It gives structure. It says the suffering means something. It says the enemy has a name. It says the future has a direction. It says the self has a role. Without that story, reality may feel too open, too ambiguous, too unresolved. So to loosen narrative capture, we often need more than facts. We need enough emotional safety to tolerate uncertainty. A person may not be able to release a story until they have another way to hold the pain the story was organizing. A group may not revise its narrative until it has enough trust to face its own contradictions. The public may not move beyond the crisis narrative until it has some sense of stability. A self may not leave a victim story until agency feels possible without abandoning the truth of harm. Discernment is not only an intellectual process, it is emotional capacity. The story often remains because the nervous system does not yet know how to live without it. So the practice is gradual. We do not rip the story away. We bring light to it. We ask what it does. We ask what it protects. We ask what it hides. We ask where it came from. We ask whether it still serves reality. We ask whether it has room to update. And we begin to separate reality from plot. What happened? What did I feel? What did I infer? What role did I assign? What evidence supports the story? What evidence complicates it? What am I afraid would happen if the story softened? What would I see if the story loosened? These questions restore space. They allow the story to become an object of awareness, rather than the total atmosphere of awareness. That is the beginning of freedom. Not freedom from story, because human beings cannot live without narrative, but freedom from being unconsciously possessed by one. Freedom to revise. Freedom to listen. Freedom to let reality interrupt the plot. Freedom to keep the truth inside the story without making the story larger than the truth. Because when the story becomes more important than reality, discernment becomes impossible. But when the story becomes visible, reality can begin to breathe again. Part 6: Counter-narratives and false liberation. Escaping one story by entering another. If narrative capture happens when a story becomes more important than reality, then there is another trap we have to understand. The trap of believing that escaping one story automatically makes us free. It does not. Sometimes a person leaves one narrative only to enter another. Sometimes a group rejects one ideology only to become captured by its opposite. Sometimes someone breaks free from a controlling frame, but then builds a new identity around opposition to that frame. Sometimes the old story is no longer believed, but it still controls the shape of the new story, because everything is now defined against it. This is false liberation. It feels like freedom because something has been rejected. A person leaves a belief system. They challenge an institution. They expose a family script. They break from a relationship pattern. They question a public narrative. They reject an identity they were given. They say, I am no longer inside that story, and that may be true. But the deeper question is, what story have they entered instead? Because freedom is not merely changing stories. Freedom is becoming conscious of the story itself. That line is central to this part. A person can leave religious dogma and enter anti-religious dogma. They may reject the authority, guilt, shame, hierarchy, or certainty of the old system, but then build a new identity around contempt for anyone who still believes. The old story said, we are the saved, they are lost. The new story says, we are the rational, they are deluded. The content changes, but the structure remains them, enlightened and blind, pure and foolish. A person can leave mainstream narratives and enter alternative narratives with the same lack of discernment. They may rightly notice that institutions can lie, media can frame, experts can be compromised, and consensus can be manufactured. That insight may be important, but then they may begin accepting every alternative source simply because it opposes the mainstream. The old authority is rejected, but a new authority quietly takes its place. The person does not become free from manipulation, they become loyal to an inverted map. A person can leave people-pleasing and become harshly self-protective. They may finally recognize that they have abandoned themselves for approval. They may set boundaries for the first time. They may stop managing everyone else's emotions. That can be a genuine liberation. But if the counter-narrative hardens, they may begin treating all compromise as self-betrayal, all care as labor, all disagreement as disrespect, and all vulnerability as danger. The old story was, I must abandon myself to keep connection. The new story becomes, I must protect myself from connection. The person has escaped collapse, but not necessarily returned to intimacy. A person can leave victimhood and become contemptuous of vulnerability. They may decide they will never be weak again. They may reject the identity of being harmed. They may become disciplined, strong, independent, and resilient. But if the counter-narrative becomes total, they may begin despising need in themselves and others. They may shame people who are still hurt. They may confuse compassion with weakness. They may build identity around invulnerability. The old story was, I am powerless. The new story becomes, powerlessness is pathetic. The wound is still governing the plot. This is why counter-narratives require discernment. A counter-narrative can be necessary. It can break the spell of a dominant story. It can restore language to people who were silenced. It can cause harm. It can be name manipulation. It can return agency. It can help someone say, what I was told was not the whole truth. In that sense, counter-narratives are often part of awakening. But a counter-narrative can also become another prison if it only reverses the roles. The villain becomes a hero. The hero becomes a villain. The oppressed becomes pure. The powerful become evil. The believer becomes a fool. The skeptic becomes savior. The old system becomes corrupt. The new system becomes true. And once again, reality is forced into fixed positions. This is why rejecting one story is not the same as seeing clearly. Sometimes the first stage of freedom is opposition. But if we remain there, our identity may still be organized by the thing we oppose. We may not be living in truth. We may be living in reaction. Reaction can feel like clarity because it has energy. It says no. It cuts. It separates. It gives oneself a boundary. For someone who has been controlled, silenced, manipulated, shamed, or abused, that may not be necessary. But if the no becomes the whole personality, then the old story still holds power. It remains the center of gravity, even as we define ourselves against it. This happens politically all the time. A person becomes disillusioned with one side and moves to the other, not through careful discernment, but through rejection. Everything the old side values becomes suspect. Everything the new side opposes becomes attractive. The person may feel they have awakened, but their perception is still organized by emotional reversal. They are not asking, what is true? They are asking, what disproves the side that disappointed me? That can lead to serious distortion. A person leaves naive trust and becomes cynical. At first, cynicism feels intelligent because it sees through false innocence. It recognizes manipulation, hypocrisy, corruption, and self-interest. It refuses to be fooled. But cynicism can become narrative capture when it treats all goodness as performance, all trust as stupidity, all hope as weakness, and all sincerity as a hidden motive. The naive story said, people are good. The cynical story says, people are fake. Both may be too simple. Discernment is neither naivety nor cynicism. It is the capacity to stay open while still seeing danger. A person leaves toxic positivity and becomes addicted to collapse narratives. They may rightly reject the pressure to always be grateful, always manifest, always see the lesson, always stay high vibration, and always choose optimism. That rejection can be healthy. But if the counter-narrative hardens, every hope becomes denial, every beauty becomes distraction, every positive possibility becomes manipulation, and every attempt at repair becomes naive. The old story was, everything is fine. The new story becomes, everything is doomed. Neither can hold the full truth. A person leaves authority and becomes dependent on anti-authority figures. This is especially common in disillusionment. Once trust in institutions collapses, the person may seek someone who confirms that collapse. A commentator, teacher, influencer, expert, dissident, or alternative leader becomes the new interpreter. They may speak against authority, but they become authority inside the counter-narrative. The person believes they are free because the new authority criticizes the old one. But if the new authority cannot be questioned, the structure has not changed. The costume changed. The dependency remained. This is one of the most important tests of false liberation. Can the new story be questioned? Can the new group tolerate dissent? Can the new identity admit uncertainty? Can the new worldview update? Can the new authority be challenged? Can the new language be examined? Can the person say, I may have escaped one distortion, but I could still be vulnerable to another? If not, the counter-narrative has become another capture. This can happen in a healing culture too. Someone leaves an identity of shame and discovers trauma language. For the first time, they can name what happened. They can understand nervous system responses, attachment wounds, emotional neglect, gaslighting, boundaries, triggers, and survival patterns. This can be profoundly freeing, but then the language can become a total story. Every discomfort becomes trauma. Every disagreement becomes gaslighting. Every difficult person becomes a narcissist. Every boundary becomes protection. Every challenge becomes unsafe. Again, the language may have begun as liberation. It gave the person a way to understand harm. But if it becomes total, it may narrow perception. It may prevent the person from seeing their own agency, their own contribution, their own capacity, their own ability to tolerate discomfort, or the complexity of other people. The story that freed them from shame can begin to trap them in fragility. This is not a criticism of trauma awareness. It is a call for maturity inside it. Language that names harm must also leave room for growth, responsibility, proportion, and change. Otherwise, healing becomes another fixed identity. The same applies to spiritual awakening narratives. Someone realizes that ordinary life is not the whole story. They experience synchronicity, intuition, altered states, deep emotional shifts, symbolic meaning, or a sense of connection beyond material explanation. The world opens. But then a counter-narrative can form. Everything is a sign, every discomfort is energy, every critic is low vibration, every doubt is ego, every coincidence is destiny, every grounded question is closed-minded. What began as an expansion becomes another kind of certainty. Real expansion should make perception wider, not less testable. A counter-narrative is healthy when it opens reality. It is unhealthy when it merely replaces one closed system with another. So the discernment questions become, have I left one story only to become possessed by another? Does this new narrative expand reality, or only invert the old one? Does it make me more honest, or only more certain? Does it return agency, or create a new dependency? Does it help me see complexity, or give me a new set of enemies? Does it allow humility, or does it give me a superior identity? These questions matter, because false liberation often feels powerful. It gives energy after helplessness. It gives identity after confusion. It gives certainty after betrayal. It gives a community after isolation. It gives language after silence. It gives anger after numbness. It gives direction after disorientation. Those things are not worthless. They may be necessary stages, but they are not the final form of discernment. Anger may help someone leave a harmful story, but anger cannot become the only lens. Skepticism may help someone question manipulation, but skepticism cannot become a reflexive dismissal of everything. Self-protection may help someone stop people-pleasing, but self-protection cannot become permanent isolation. Moral clarity may help someone name harm, but moral clarity cannot become superiority. Awakening may help someone see hidden patterns, but awakening cannot become identity inflation. The deeper freedom is not just the ability to say no to the old story. It is the ability to remain conscious in the new one. That requires humility. It requires the willingness to ask, where might this story also be incomplete? It requires the courage to examine the narrative that now gives us belonging, status, certainty, or relief. It requires us to notice when we have started defending the new story with the same rigidity we once criticized in the old one. This is difficult because the new story often feels like salvation. It may have helped us survive. It may have given us language. It may have connected us with others. It may have restored dignity. Questioning it can feel like losing the freedom it gave us. But real freedom should survive questioning. If the story collapses the moment it is examined, it was not freedom. It was another enclosure. A mature counter-narrative does not demand worship. It says, "This helped me see what I could not see before, but it is not the whole of reality." It says, "This story corrected something, but it may not explain everything." It says, "This language gave me agency, but I must not use it to avoid accountability." It says, "This group helped me belong, but my perception must remain alive." It says, "This opposition was necessary, but I do not want to be defined forever by what I oppose." That is the transition from reaction to discernment. Reaction asks, "What must I reject?" Discernment asks, "What is true now?" Reaction asks, "Who was wrong?" Discernment asks, "What can I see more clearly?" Reaction asks, "How do I protect myself from the old story?" Discernment asks, "How do I live without being governed by either the old story or its opposite?" This does not mean becoming neutral in the face of harm. Some stories must be rejected. Some systems must be resisted. Some narratives are abusive, deceptive, or dehumanizing. But even resistance needs discernment, or it can reproduce the structure it opposes. A person can fight control while becoming controlling. They can fight shame while shaming. They can fight dogma while becoming dogmatic. They can fight dehumanization while dehumanizing. They can fight manipulation while manipulating for the right side. That is ethical inversion through narrative, and it begins when the counterstory becomes sacred. So the invitation in this part is to examine the stories that came after escape. The story you entered after leaving the family script. The story you entered after betrayal. The story you entered after waking up to manipulation. The story you entered after leaving a group. The story you entered after discovering trauma. The story you entered after becoming skeptical. The story you entered after finding your voice. Did it expand you, or did it harden you? Did it return you to reality? Or did it make one part of reality into the whole? Did it give you agency? Or did it give you a new identity that must now be defended? Freedom is not merely changing stories. Freedom is learning how to hold stories lightly enough that reality can still interrupt them. Part 7 Field Case Scenario. A public controversy becomes a story war to bring narrative capture into a real-world field. Let us imagine a public controversy unfolding in real time. At first, there is no complete story. There are only fragments. A short video clip appears online. It shows a public figure, a teacher, a politician, a creator, a business owner, or someone with a visible role saying something that sounds troubling. The clip is brief. Perhaps it is 30 seconds. Perhaps it has been removed from a longer conversation. Perhaps it includes the most emotionally charged moment, but not what came before or after. Then a screenshot appears. Then a comment. Then an accusation. Then a denial. Then someone who claims to know the person adds context. Then someone else says the context is an excuse. Then an older post is found. Then a second clip emerges. Then a commentator makes a thread. Then a larger account shares it. Then a media outlet summarizes it. Then the reaction becomes bigger than the original event. At this stage, the facts are still incomplete, but the stories are already forming. One group sees a villain. They say, "This proves what we already knew. This person is dangerous, corrupt, manipulative, hypocritical, abusive, or morally bankrupt." Every new detail is placed into that role. If the person apologizes, the apology is manipulation. If they remain silent, the silence is guilt. If they defend themselves, the defense is evasion. If someone offers context, that person becomes an enabler. The role has been assigned, and the event is now evidence for the role. Another group sees a victim. They say, "This person is being targeted. This is a pile-on. The clip is taken out of context. People want to destroy them. This is mob behavior. This is what happens when someone says something inconvenient." In this narrative, criticism becomes persecution. Evidence becomes weaponization. Accountability becomes an attack. The person at the center is no longer being examined as a complex human being who may have caused harm, made a mistake, been misunderstood, or all three. They become the symbolic victim of a hostile field. Another group sees a conspiracy. They say, "Why is this appearing now? Who benefits? This is a distraction. This is coordinated. This is not about the person. This is about controlling attention." Sometimes coordination is real. Sometimes timing matters. Sometimes public stories are amplified for strategic reasons. But the conspiracy narrative may quickly become total. Every uncertainty becomes evidence of hidden design. Every missing fact becomes proof of concealment. Every challenge becomes proof that the challenger is part of the operation. Another group sees moral failure. They say, "This is not complicated. They did wrong." Anyone asking for context is avoiding accountability. This narrative may be rooted in a genuine ethical concern. Sometimes people do cause harm and hide behind complexity. Sometimes calls for nuance are used to delay responsibility. But if the moral failure narrative becomes total, it may treat all questions as excuses. It may punish proportion. It may collapse the difference between asking for accuracy and defending harm. Another group sees media manipulation. They say, "Look at how quickly everyone is reacting. Look at the framing. Look at the emotional language. Look at the way the clip has been edited. Look at the headlines." This narrative can reveal something important about attention, framing, and perception design. But if it hardens, it may dismiss the substance of the issue entirely. It may become so focused on manipulation around the story that it refuses to ask whether the original concern contains truth. Another group sees systemic injustice. They say, this event is not isolated. It reflects a wider pattern. This is about power, culture, institutions, inequality, exploitation, or social harm. This narrative can widen the lens beyond the individual. It can reveal patterns that a purely personal story would miss. But if it becomes total, the individual facts may be forced into the larger theory too quickly. The specific person becomes a symbol before the event has been fully understood. Another group sees cultural decline. They say this is another sign of where society is going. Standards are collapsing. People cannot speak anymore. People have lost morality. Public life has become cruel. The culture is sick. The event becomes evidence of a much larger story. Again, there may be truth in recognizing cultural patterns, but the danger is that the specific situation disappears into a pre-existing decline narrative. Another group sees awakening. They say, people are finally seeing the truth. This moment is exposing what has been hidden. The mask is slipping. This can feel powerful because it turns controversy into revelation, but it can also create premature certainty. The event becomes proof of whatever the group already believed was being exposed. Now, the original event is no longer only an event. It has become a story war. The public is no longer simply asking, what happened? It is asking, which story does this event belong to? Is it a story of harm, a story of persecution, a story of corruption, a story of manipulation, a story of decline, a story of awakening, a story of justice, a story of censorship, a story of accountability, a story of mob behavior? Each narrative selects different fragments. The villain narrative selects evidence of guilt. The victim narrative selects evidence of unfair treatment. The conspiracy narrative selects evidence of timing and hidden incentive. The moral failure narrative selects evidence of harm. The media manipulation narrative selects evidence of framing. The systemic narrative selects evidence of wider patterns. The decline narrative selects evidence of cultural decay. The awakening narrative selects evidence of exposure. Each story may contain something worth examining. That is what makes this difficult. The discerning person cannot simply say, all narratives are false. That would be lazy. Sometimes a villain narrative points to real harm. Sometimes a victim narrative points to a real pylon. Sometimes a conspiracy narrative notices real coordination. Sometimes a moral narrative names something that should not be excused. Sometimes a media manipulation narrative reveals how public emotion is being guided. Sometimes a systemic narrative correctly identifies a wider pattern. Sometimes decline is real in one area. Sometimes awakening language names genuine disillusionment. But the question is whether the story remains open to reality. What facts are known? What is inferred? What is assumed? What has been emotionally added? What role has already been assigned? What evidence would challenge the role? What does this narrative make visible? And what does it hide? This is where most public controversies become dangerous for discernment. People begin defending the story they joined before they have fully examined the event. They react to the emotional meaning of the controversy, not only the facts. Their group position forms quickly. Their identity attaches. Their status may become involved. Their moral self may become involved. The story becomes socially reinforced. Now changing one's mind becomes costly. If I have publicly declared someone a villain, I may resist evidence that complicates the villain role. If I have publicly defended them as a victim, I may resist evidence that shows real harm. If I have framed the whole event as media manipulation, I may resist the possibility that manipulation and wrongdoing can coexist. If I have called it proof of systemic injustice, I may resist details that do not fit the pattern cleanly. If I have called it a conspiracy, I may resist ordinary explanations. This is how narrative captures perception. The event becomes less important than the story people need the event to prove. In the middle of this, discernment does something unfashionable. It slows down. It refuses to join the story war too quickly. It asks what is actually known, not what is claimed, not what's implied, not what the crowd has decided. What is known? What is the source? What has been verified? What is the full context? What is missing? What is being inferred from timing, identity, reputation, or past behavior? Then it asks what story is forming around the fragments. Who has been made the hero? Who has been made the victim? Who has been made the villain? Who has been made the fool? Who has been made the traitor? Who has been made the savior? And what emotional state does each role produce? The villain role produces condemnation. The victim role produces protection. The traitor role produces disgust. The fool role produces superiority. The savior role produces trust. The persecuted truth-teller role produces loyalty. These roles guide behavior. If someone is framed as villain, punishment feels justified. If someone is framed as victim, defense feels necessary. If someone is framed as traitor, exclusion feels righteous. If someone is framed as savior, questioning feels dangerous. Narrative does not only interpret, it authorizes response. That is why story wars can become so intense. People are not just discussing facts, they are defending the emotional permissions their story gives them. Discernment asks us to separate layers. The event is one layer, the evidence is another, the interpretation is another, the emotional state is another, the group response is another, the moral conclusion is another, the behavior being encouraged is another. When these layers collapse into one another, people become easier to move. A clip becomes a verdict, a feeling becomes certainty, a group reaction becomes proof. a role becomes identity, a story becomes reality. A discerning response might sound slower than the field wants. I do not know enough yet. This looks concerning, but I need more context. That defense may be too simple. That accusation may be too fast. There may be real harm here, and there may also be framing. I want to know what happened before deciding what this means. I can take the issue seriously without joining the emotional stampede. This kind of response may not perform well publicly. It may not satisfy the demand for instant moral positioning, but it protects perception. It allows reality to arrive before the story finishes writing itself, and that is the practice. In a story war, the task is not to have no story. The task is to notice which story is trying to recruit you, what role it wants you to play, what emotion it is producing, what behavior it is encouraging, and what facts it is asking you to ignore. Because once the story becomes visible, we can remain human inside the controversy. We can care without being captured. We can question without becoming cynical. We can hold people accountable without turning them into symbols. We can recognize manipulation without denying harm. We can see patterns without forcing every fragment into the same plot. And we can let reality interrupt the story before the story decides reality for us. Part 8, the narrative discernment practice. What story am I a part of? If narrative organizes perception, then the practice is to notice the story before it becomes reality. We can call this practice the narrative check. The first question is, what story am I inside right now? Is this a story of abandonment, betrayal, decline, awakening, rescue, persecution, injustice, failure, superiority, danger, or personal inadequacy? The second question is, who am I in this story? Am I the victim, hero, outsider, rescuer, truth teller, fool, rejected one, strong one, broken one, awakened one, or the one who must never need? The third question is, who has been assigned the other roles? Who is the villain? Who is the savior? Who is the threat? Who is the person I have already decided cannot be trusted? The fourth question is, what facts does this story highlight? Every story selects. What evidence does this narrative keep bringing forward? The fifth question is, what facts does it ignore? What does the story struggle to include? What detail would complicate it? What evidence would make the plot less clean? The sixth question is, what emotion does this story keep producing? Fear, anger, shame, grief, superiority, urgency, resentment, hope, loyalty, or helplessness? The seventh question is, what behavior does this story make feel necessary? Withdraw, attack, defend, comply, expose, rescue, punish, prove, hide, chase, or give up? The eighth question is, what would challenge this story? If nothing could challenge it, the narrative may no longer be helping you understand reality. It may be capturing it. And finally, what would reality look like if I loosened the plot? This practice is not about living without story. That is impossible. Human beings need narrative. We need meaning, memory, coherence, and continuity. But we also need enough discernment to know when a story has become too rigid. Discernment does not destroy narrative. It stops narrative from becoming a cage. Part 9, integration. Living with story without becoming imprisoned by it. So, as we come towards the close of this episode, we return to the central insight. Narrative is one of the deepest structures of human perception. We do not only encounter life as isolated facts, isolated memories, isolated events, isolated conflicts, isolated images, or isolated moments. We connect them. We arrange them. We give them sequence, character, emotional meaning, and expectation. We ask what happened, why it happened, who was responsible, what role we played, what kind of world this proves we are living in, and what future is likely to come next. That is narrative. Narrative connects fragments into meaning. It gives identity continuity. It helps the self say, this is who I have been. This is what happened to me. This is what I learned. This is what I fear. This is what I hope. This is what I must protect. This is what I must never become again. It binds groups together. It gives communities a shared memory, a shared wound, a shared mission, a shared enemy, a shared hope, or a shared language. It tells people who we are and who they are. It tells members what counts as loyalty, what counts as betrayal, what questions are safe, what doubts are dangerous, and what emotional response is expected. It shapes public reality. Cultural and political narratives tell societies whether they are living through progress, decline, crisis, betrayal, awakening, rescue, restoration, liberation, or collapse. They do not merely describe events. They tell people how to feel about events, what to fear, what to trust, what to defend, what to resist, and what kind of future to imagine. Narrative helps human beings orient themselves through uncertainty, and that is why it is necessary. Without story, experience becomes scattered, memory lacks shape, suffering lacks context, identity becomes unstable, public life becomes incoherent. A person cannot live as a loose pile of events. A group cannot organize itself without shared meaning. A culture cannot move through time without stories about what it is, what it has lost, what it is becoming, and what it believes is worth protecting. So the point of this episode has not been to reject narrative. The point has been to become conscious of narrative, because the same structure that helps us orient can also imprison. Perception. A story can become so familiar, so emotionally charged, so identity protective, so socially rewarded, or so morally sacred that reality is no longer allowed to interrupt it. That is narrative capture. It happens when the story becomes more important than reality. A personal story may begin with real abandonment, real betrayal, real shame, real silence, real harm, real survival. But if the story becomes total, every new experience is forced into the old plot. Every delay becomes rejection. Every disagreement becomes danger. Every silence becomes proof. Every act of care becomes suspicious. Every mistake becomes confirmation. The story that once protected the self begins predicting the future so strongly that the present cannot breathe. A group story may begin with real injustice, real exclusion, real insight, real solidarity, real hidden truth. But if the story becomes total, belonging begins to require loyalty to the plot. The group cannot admit its own cruelty because it sees itself as compassionate. It cannot admit its emotional investment because it sees itself as rational. It cannot admit its arrogance because it sees itself as awakened. It cannot admit its power because it sees itself only as harmed. The story gives identity, but it also decides what the group must not see. A public story may begin with real decline, real progress, real crisis, real betrayal, real corruption, real hope, or real need for rescue. But if the story becomes total, every event becomes evidence for the same conclusion. Every question becomes suspicious. Every complexity becomes betrayal. Every alternative frame becomes danger. The public stops examining events and begins feeding the plot. This is why the discerning person learns to ask, what story am I inside? That question interrupts automatic meaning. It asks, am I inside a story of abandonment, betrayal, decline, awakening, rescue, persecution, injustice, failure, superiority, danger, personal inadequacy? Am I inside a story that was once useful, but has now become too narrow? Then comes the next question, what role am I playing? Am I the victim, the hero, the outsider, the rescuer, the truth-teller, the fool, the rejected one, the strong one, the broken one, the awakened one, the one who must never need? And if I'm playing that role, what does the role allow me to see, and what does it prevent me from becoming? Sometimes the role contains dignity. The survivor really did survive. The truth-teller really did speak. The outsider really did notice what others missed. The rescuer really did care. But if the role becomes fixed, it can trap the self inside one chapter of its own life. The survivor may continue surviving when living is possible. The truth-teller may become unable to listen. The rescuer may confuse love with responsibility for everyone else. The outsider may reject belonging before belonging can reject them. The broken one may not recognize the ways they are already healing. So we ask, what does this story help me see? Every narrative gives sight in one direction. It may reveal harm, hidden power, repeated patterns, emotional danger, injustice, betrayal, family roles, social manipulation, institutional decay, or spiritual meaning. We should not dismiss what a story reveals simply because it is a story. But we must also ask, what does it prevent me from seeing? Does it prevent me from seeing care because I expect abandonment? Does it prevent me from seeing complexity because I need moral certainty? Does it prevent me from seeing my own agency because I am attached to injury? Does it prevent me from seeing another person's humanity because I have assigned them the villain role? Does it prevent me from seeing my own group's distortion because belonging depends on keeping the group clean? This is where discernment deepens. We ask, what evidence would challenge this story? If nothing could challenge it, the story has become closed. If every contradiction is absorbed, if every doubt is reframed, if every new fact is forced back into the same plot, then the narrative is no longer serving reality. It is protecting itself. A living story can update. A captured story cannot. A living story can say, this was true, but it is not the whole truth. A captured story says, this explains everything. A living story can honor the past without forcing the future to repeat it. A captured story demands loyalty from the future. A living story can hold pain, responsibility, hope, and complexity together. A captured story needs clean roles. So we ask, does this story leave room for change? Can the abandoned person receive care? Can the wounded person have agency? Can the skeptic trust again without becoming naive? Can the believer question without losing meaning? Can the group admit harm without collapsing? Can the public story include both danger and hope, both progress and cost, both betrayal and the possibility of repair? Then we ask the deepest question, am I using this story to understand reality or to protect identity? This is not a question of blame. Many stories protect identity because identity needs protection. A person may have needed the story to survive. A group may have needed the story to resist erasure. A culture may have needed the story to organize fear or hope. But if the story now prevents reality from interrupting identity, it becomes dangerous. And finally, what would become visible if the plot loosened? Perhaps the person you cast as villain is more complex. Perhaps the role you cast yourself in is too small. Perhaps the group you belong to is both healing and distorting. Perhaps the public narrative contains truth, but not enough truth. Perhaps the pain that shaped you is real, but not final. Perhaps the story that helped you survive is no longer large enough for the person you are becoming. That is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a more conscious relationship with it. Episode 11 has shown that narrative is not only storytelling, it is reality organization. It shapes identity, memory, belonging, morality, fear, hope, and expectation. When narrative becomes unconscious, people do not simply believe stories. They live inside them. We have explored why human beings need narrative, how personal stories become identity, how group stories create belonging, how cultural and political stories organize public reality, how narrative captures forces facts into a fixed plot, and how counter-narratives can create false liberation when escaping one story simply means entering another. Across all of it, the central lesson is this: stories can help us survive, but discernment must help us remain free enough to revise them. A story can hold truth without being the whole truth. A story can protect dignity without owning identity. A story can explain the past without controlling the future, and a story can give meaning without becoming a cage. In the next episode, we continue with episode 12, Moral Certainty and Ethical Inversion. If episode 11 explored how narratives organize reality, episode 12 moves into what happens when those narratives become morally fused, when being right replaces being true, when certainty replaces humility, and when harm can be justified in the name of goodness, safety, justice, compassion, or protection. Because once a story becomes morally sacred, the next question is, what can people justify in order to defend it? This is where narrative becomes ethics, where the story no longer only explains what happened, but tells people who is good, who is evil, who deserves compassion, who deserves punishment, who must be protected, who must be silenced, and what kinds of harm can be excused because the cause feels righteous. Episode 12 will ask how morality becomes inverted when certainty takes over, how people can use ethical language to justify unethical behavior, how groups can shame in the name of compassion, control in the name of safety, dehumanize in the name of justice, and punish in the name of goodness. It will ask how discernment can remain morally serious without becoming morally possessed. So as you leave this episode, consider one question. What story has been holding your world together so tightly that reality has struggled to interrupt it? And perhaps a second, who might you become if the story softened, without denying what it once helped you survive? May you learn to recognize the stories that hold your world together. May you honor the stories that helped you survive without allowing them to imprison what you can now become. May your discernment become spacious enough to see the plot, question the role, loosen the frame, and return to reality before the story decides it for you. Until next time, thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to the Discernment Field, Episode 11, Narrative Capture and Reality Construction, How Stories Organize Perception. I'm James Miller.